Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I have the great pleasure of being with Felipe Valencia Caicedo. Felipe is assistant professor in the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia, and he's the editor of Roots of Underdevelopment, a new economic and political history of Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm very happy to have Felipe here with me for many reasons. We're good friends. Also, the book is quite amazing for many reasons, including that I have a chapter in the book.
Probably the most important one.
Of course, but there are many other very great chapters in the book, and I'm super excited. You're gonna have a lot of fun listening to our conversation. But let me say a proper hi to Felipe first. Felipe, how are you?
I'm good. It's a pleasure to be officially in your podcast. We are, of course, good friends, but it's the first time that I make it here. Essentially, I had to edit a book in order to be interviewed by you. So it's an honor and a pleasure, jokes aside.
No, it's actually pretty great that you're here. And let me start with some question about your background that I know because we're friends, but of course there's probably people in the audience that don't know much about you. And you're Colombian. Now you teach at British Columbia, but you've had quite an exciting career, if you allow me to say that. I know that, for instance, and this is not very common. You did your undergrad in the US. You studied at Brown. You did your PhD in Europe. I don't even know very well at what point you work at the World Bank. What's your story? Like, how did you end up being a scholar interested in the history of Latin America?
Okay, well, that's a good question. So yes, I'm born and raised in Colombia. We are fellow Colombians. It was great to hear you pronounce my name correctly, which is not usual for more North American audiences. I decided to study in the US. My high school was not an American high school, but we had some US requirements like taking the SAT. So at some point, I started talking to college counselors, applied to a few schools, was about to go to Cornell because back then I was interested in engineering. And then I met with a few alumni from Brown that said, like, no, you need to go to Brown. Let me tell you, like, why. And I was convinced, and I think it was the best decision that I've taken, academically at least. And I think a lot of the interests in economics, in economic history, growth, development emanate from way back when. So at that point, I still didn't know if I wanted to be an engineer or not. So I started to take a lot of physics and math courses. And eventually I ended up, so at Brown, you declare your major at your fourth semester. So I did economic history. Well, I mean, economics and mathematics and international relations. So it was kind of like a mix of economics and history. I then decided to go to grad school. I got a master's first at Yale, and then decided to work a bit more, or a bit. So I was first an intern at Goldman Sachs in more the financial side of things for one summer, and then I worked at the office of the chief economist in DC, with someone who's now the chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean. That's William Maloney. Back then he was principal economist. And I think that a lot of the stuff that I do now in terms of economic history first started with Bill. So this was the time of reading, I guess, what today are the classics like Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. And we would read these papers and we would be fascinated and try to get new data and test different hypotheses from history, from economics. And I think that by then I realized probably at some point my dream was to work at the World Bank, but I was already at the World Bank, so I think I had to change my dreams. And by then I was, I think, 9 years in the US. So I don't know if fully, but quite Americanized. And I've always had this idea of studying at the LSE. So I applied to schools in Europe, and the LSE didn't accept my master's. Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona did. And I ended up there, I guess, mostly trying to work with a Ciccone, more in economic growth. And I also took this course with a professor called Joachim Voth. Back then, he was teaching financial bubbles, which I know very little about, and I have very little interest in. But he also apparently was very good at economic history. So little did I know that I was embarking in this voyage, which today we're talking about many years later, on, I think, a particular brand or a particular side of economic history, which I think it's a mix of history, development, growth, political economy. And I think for that, being in Barcelona when Joaquin was still there was an amazing coincidence that shaped my career, and I think still shaping my career. So I would say that Brown was very important, working a little bit in more the practical side of development of the bank, and definitely being with Joaquim, or being Joaquim's student at the time in Barcelona, were three great pillars of what we're going to talk about today.
Do you remember at what time you gave up on the idea of being at a place like the World Bank? Because it's a common aspiration for young economists, right? Like when you're an undergrad student, well, probably most people think like, oh, I want to be at the World Bank, at the IMF, or like at a central bank. And it's very common that dream fades away. And
Yeah.
I'm not even sure for exactly what
I
reason.
mean, the way I see it is that anyone that studies, I guess, from economics to finance or finance related subjects, at some point says, okay, I'm not closing any door, so I can go to the private sector. For me, that was, I guess, Goldman Sachs. That lasted one summer. It was great, but at some point, I don't know, I guess I realized it was not what I really wanted to do. That was right before the big financial crisis, so I'm very thankful I didn't took that one. Um, but then there are at least two other options: the more policy side, the multilateral side, and academia. And for me, it was very important to explore that side. Growing up in Colombia, I think the bank and the IMF are important, almost in a positive way. I don't think that you would say that if you were from Argentina, for instance. Like, the relationship between Argentina and the IMF is not the best. It's very tight, but it's very confrontational too. And for us, having people like Guillermo Perry being the chief economist of Latin America, we didn't overlap, but still, he was obviously a big presence at the bank. And I had that idea that it was almost like a dream. And the bank is a great institution. Like, I don't think that this is the time for me to speak badly about the bank. It has good and bad things. For me, it was excellent. I think it really depends on who you end up working with, and working with Bill was fantastic. I mean, we're still in touch. We are co-authors. We have to publish articles together. We talk a lot about the region. I mean, now he's pretty busy and famous, but that was great. But also at some point, back then, what I thought is, even if I want to stay at the bank, to go higher up at the bank, I probably would need a PhD. So at that time, actually, the job I applied to initially, I didn't get it because someone with a PhD, actually from Pompeu Fabra, got it. So I thought the message was very clear. Like, if you want to escalate at the bank and go higher, maybe you need a PhD. I don't know if that's still true anymore. But then when you actually do the PhD, you also change a little bit. I guess maybe your preferences change, or you are either selected, or you get some training that academia is very important and that ideas matter. And I think the bank is very good at that. But if you really want to do that, think about one piece of research for 3 years. I think you rather be in academia. So I'm not close to the policy world, but I think that it was enough exploration back then. Maybe in the future I would go back to the policy world or to the policy making world. For now, I'm very happy in academia, and I think it gives you the time to think about things, but also to interact with policy and policymakers. So, I mean, I do history, so our stuff, or at least my stuff, I'll speak for myself, is not the most relevant in the world. But I recently worked with the IDB and other institutions on a chapter for the historical origins of inequality in Latin America. So even from history, I think we can have productive dialogues with policymakers, at least at places like the IDB and the World Bank. And so, yeah, I guess that's answering a bit your question in a
Right.
round
And
manner.
and and you're being very modest because actually, I mean, your research has quite a lot of eco in the policy world, and I know people that very policy oriented that know about your work and are inspired by that. So certainly, and let me probably use that to start talking about the book, and because it has, well, this very reflexive approach, and I think that the title summarizes that very well, right? So, and I think you did a great job picking that specific title, right? So the roots of underdevelopment clearly says, okay, we're going to think very deeply about our modern society, and by our society I mean Latin America, because both of us are Latin Americans. But the subtitle also seems to have quite a lot on it, and I want to ask you about it because you describe it as a new economic and political history of Latin America. And what's the new part of it? What type of dialogue are you building here? It's new compared with what? What is this old thing, and in what sense we are new from that perspective?
Okay, sure. So the book, as you well mentioned, so Roots of Underdevelopment. I hope that those of you that are listening at some point can also see the image of Daniel Lievano, which is a beautiful illustration, and I think the image also captures very well of there's some reality, but it has deep roots. Back to Brown, so you might remember the article that Enrico Spolaore and Roman Waxiark wrote in the Journal of Economic Literature in 2013. So I think that this rooted word is very much in the historical development literature, and that was summarized by now my colleague Nathan Nunn back then at Harvard. So that's the root part. Underdevelopment, I mean, that's a very Latin American word. And I think not only in economics, if you think Memorias del Subdesarrollo, Memories of Underdevelopment, the classic Cuban movie. I mean, it's a word that I think it's almost synonymous with Latin America. We're not the poorest continent. We're probably the most unequal continent, but we're not fully developed. So we're kind of there, neither here nor there. I think every time that you see some graph of whatever is it on income or education, we're always there in the middle. So I think it's a good check to know to see if Sweden and Norway are doing very well and Latin America is in the middle, then probably the graph is right on whatever is it. And the new part, I think that I think that we're being a bit radical in this book. So I'll tell you what I see as the old part. Again, this is not the time to speak badly about anyone. But there are different ways to see economic history in Latin America. There's one that I really don't like, which would be things like open veins of Latin America. When I was a student in undergrad, there were some classes that were taught with that book. I mean, some people might like it on literary grounds. I think on economic grounds and historical grounds is probably not right, or at least I don't like it. And there was a lot of negative encouragement from that book of like, okay, there must be something better. And I think that sometimes when you feel that, it's also an impulse to say, okay, why don't we do it? No. So what's new? I think that what's new is more of a methodological approach rather than topics. So good data. I don't think that's necessarily new, but kind of following the cliometric revolution in the US. So data matters. Going to archives or getting new data from so many things. I mean, old maps, satellites. I mean, I think we're probably going to talk more about your work later, but networks. So new data and good data. I mean, of old historical sources, and I mean, it's all a history book, but I think new data matters. Methods and empirics, not necessarily that it has to be identified IVs, RDs. I've written myself a chapter on that called Historical Econometrics for those of you that are more like technically oriented and want to see that. But at least empirics regressions, like, okay, here's the data, and maybe go a bit beyond just data description. So how is it that we can use it? In your case, like, we have these people, but these people are connected, and this is gonna like give us some information in your case about like bankers in Antioquia. And not necessarily persistence, because I think that by now it's a very loaded word. But some paying attention, I guess, from what you started with, which is the world today. So let me just, I mean, criticize myself or speak for myself. So I was interested in Jesuit missions in Paraguay, and I could have stayed there. I mean, it's a fascinating topic and just write something about the past. But when you visit these areas and you see the ruins and you talk to people, that history is very much present. And I don't know if that's a global thing, but at least in Latin America, if you go to certain areas, the history is there. The history is there from pre-colonial times. If you think about the Aztecs and the Incas and the Mayas and the Chibchas and the Muiscas, history is there from colonial times. I was just coming from Cartagena. I mean, if you want to see colonial Spain, book a trip to Cartagena, aside from the fact that it's gorgeous, and you're gonna see history there. Puerto Rico is similar, La Habana is similar, Lima is similar, Bogota, Mexico City, Quito, history is there. And so I was very interested in that, and that's where I think this everything kind of like came together. I mean, you're talking out of Stanford. I mean, they say that in Palo Alto at some point, like, you connect the dots, and I don't know, and Steve Jobs and other people have connected the dots. So I'm no Steve Jobs, but at some point you say, well, I'm interested in history and economics. What about like connecting the two? And then you say, okay, yeah, sure. Maybe these Jesuit missions that are super interesting, maybe they have an impact not only back then because they were expelled, but even today, and even when they were expelled. So that connection, that dialogue between the past and the present is something that I'm fascinated by. I think back to my personal history, all of this literature emerged when I was in grad school. So I remember reading Melissa Dell's piece, reading Nathan Nunn. So it's almost, and I know that you also like literature a lot, it's almost like being in the Latin American boom and reading 100 Years of Solitude and Conversación en la Catedral, Vargas Llosa, Cortázar, etc., back when they were being released. So that unfortunately was not my case, but I was there when all of these quote unquote persistence or historical development or new history or however you want to call it, articles were being released. And yeah, I guess I was absorbing that knowledge, and I was also interested in creating some myself. And I think that what you see in the book is that connection and collection of topics. So good data, empirical methods. I mean, we're all still very much, and again, you're at Stanford, so we are following Guido Imbens, and we're following people like Angrist, Card, Kruger in identification matters. So all of us, it doesn't matter if you're in economic history, if you're in labor, we're very much riding that wave. But also the past matters. So I think that what is new in the book is not retelling the economic history of Costa Rica, going year by year and telling you what happened. That's important. I'm not saying that's not important. We're not saying that is not important in this book, but I think it's more about what are big events in Latin American history. And I guess Melissa Dell was one of the first ones to do this with her famous study of the Mita in Peru and Bolivia, and say, okay, that's very interesting. That's colonial history. Maybe we hate the institution, but did it have a long-term impact? And I think this book takes those lessons very seriously and tries to uncover similar lessons, maybe not only for Peru. Back then we had one big Mita article for the whole of Latin America, and now we have two, three, or more articles per country in Latin America. And maybe we talk a little bit about the country structure, which is a bit strange for economics, but it's what we chose for the book.
I'm very glad that you brought up the Latin American boom, because I mean, in a certain way, I feel that, I mean, what you're doing with the book is to give some identity of what is by now probably I mean, I don't want to call this a school of thought or something like that, but at least a community of intellectuals that are thinking in a certain way Latin America, right? And it's just not just about the history itself, because yeah, many of us are thinking about modern Latin America, but we're thinking about it from the past, and many of that people are in this book, and the effort that you have done to put together the volume and to bring some context to it, I think that plays an important role. And I'm very optimistic about the idea that, in the long term, people are gonna, I don't know, and I mean by this, in 10, 15, 20 years, they're gonna look back and they're gonna be able to put a name to what we were doing, maybe looking at the book and saying like, oh, the people from the roots of Underdevelopment or something. So, and I'm gonna ask you more about that in a bit, about how you put together the team, which it's already quite amazing, the people that are in the volume. But before that, I'd like to continue with this topic that you introduced, this structure of nation states, right? So the book is, and there were many potential ways of organizing the book, right? You could have decided of going through chronological structure, or whatever. But for those of you, the book is, by the way, going to be released pretty soon. We're recording this in late November, and probably should be out in a few weeks from now. And when you're going to be able to see the book, you will see that you have about a chapter per country, right? Per countries to date. So there's a chapter on Mexico, a chapter on Argentina, which is not the same thing to say that each chapter is the history of each country, right? So I want to ask you about that. Like, how did you think about this? Why you ended up being like that? Why did you decided to against the other options? What was your purpose and with that decision?
Okay, sure. So first of all, and maybe I'm gonna end the question with that. Yeah, what I'm most happy about is the group of researchers that have been consolidated around these topics. I feel, and I write that in the introduction, a bit like Nathan Nunn summarizing the literature in 2009 and again in 2013. There wouldn't have been a book if there's no literature on this topic, on historical development of Latin America. So I think my role was to consolidate that, as when you write for the Journal of Economic Literature, the Journal of Economic Perspectives, but then hopefully by consolidating that, also creating a type of snowball effect. And I'll tell you more about that later. But it's a way to see what was there again, to connect the dots. And so now let me tell you a little bit more about how. So my idea, instead of saying I want someone to tell me again what was the history of Colombia or Argentina, was to pick people. So you, for instance, in the case of Colombia, that I thought that were working on very exciting topics for a particular country or a set of countries, and say you have full editorial liberty, and I think that you can attest to that, and you write on whatever is it that you find interesting of that specific country. So obviously, I mean, there's bias because I knew you and I knew that you were working on interesting topics, and I knew more or less that you were working on elites and elite formation and networks, and we can discuss that in more detail, but you were free to write on whatever is it that you wanted. And at the beginning we were around 10 friends. At the end it ended up being 20 chapters, and I'm going to tell you there's probably a volume 2 in the making as well. And so that for me was the most interesting way to proceed. Obviously then it's a bit hard to tie everything together, so writing the introduction was hard, but it was not as hard as I thought, because even though I gave everyone full liberty, there's some big topics. So there is elite formation, there is conflict, there is migration. So I didn't tell the writers, the authors for Argentina or Brazil to write on migration, but they both wrote on migration, because if you think about Argentina, just as before we're talking about Mexico and Colombia, you cannot think about the history or the modern realities of Argentina without thinking about migration. And something very similar happens to Brazil. So I didn't ask them to coordinate, and there are some important topics there. Having said that, and I don't know if you want to talk about that now or later, there is one overarching written by Jose Antonio Campo, who back then was Colombia's finance minister, not anymore. That's how like politics is much faster than history and academia. And Luis Bertola, who's a giant in the economic history field of Latin America. And it's I think it's like a swivel, a bisagra. I think the word is very beautiful there in Spanish, between that classic traditional economic history of the region, if we think about Bertolano Campos' book of 2012, and back to what's new, our newer approach. So yes, you can think about the region, and you can think about commodity cycles and the secular decline of the region during the 20th century, and that's great. And I mean, that's why we actually value very much that first chapter, to have that big overarching view. But I also think it's very interesting to go into one topic like yours, no, elite formation in Antioquia. And I mean, you're not telling much about coffee in your chapter. You're not saying almost anything about violence in Colombia. So those are big topics. I mean, there's another chapter that looks at this in the book. So Colombia is the one country that had 2 chapters. But I thought that by going very micro, you can still talk a lot about Colombia today. And I mean, in your particular chapter, like the concentration of economic and financial power in one region in Colombia, in this case Antioquia, it's important in the 19th century, and it's important today, and I think it's important to analyze regardless. So that was the approach, and I mean, I think that in that way the book is a bit of a hodgepodge, and it could be disconnected, but the methodological thread is there. I think some very interesting general topics are there. And again, maybe we end with that, but I think that volume 2, if there's a volume 2, could continue with this and maybe cover some of the gaps that are now missing in this first run. But we're talking about 20 chapters, 600 pages. So I think that it's a good start. It's a good first step. And maybe just to end on this, and back at Stanford and where you're conducting the interview, Steve Haber was the first one to do this. He also did 2 volumes. He actually read and wrote some very nice words for the book. Back then they analyzed 3 countries, 4 countries. And so I think at least in that regard, we are analyzing more countries. I'm not saying that we're doing it better. But that was kind of a dialogue that we also tried to have. And I'm talking about obviously a now super classic book called How Latin America Fell Behind, where 1997, where there were great pieces. I mean, among others, probably the most influential, which was Engelman and Sokol of 1997. So natural endowments, institutions, like that was all from that book. So we were never gonna reach that, but definitely we want to continue that dialogue.
I'm surprised that you have energy for a second volume, but another 5 years of work. But sounds someone has to do it, right?
So I had a great friend who I mean we are connecting with literature who read The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, and I asked him, well, so what did you do when you finished it? He said, like, well, I started again, of course. So I think this felt like a Magic Mountain moment. Because I was writing the conclusion and well, actually the conclusion is by Alberto Diaz Calleros, also from Stanford, so we can talk about that. But so there's a lot of Stanford links apparently. Um, but I was going back and kind of getting a big overview of what we accomplished and also what was missing, and I think I was being very self-critical. Try to also see what biases I had. And there were some glaring omissions, again, because I didn't ask people write about slavery in Brazil. I said write about Brazil, and if they didn't write about slavery, even though I'm very interested in the topic, like it was just not covered. Having said that, we have Suriname and we have a great chapter on slavery, so it's not like we didn't talk about slavery at all. But to be fair, there was no chapter for Cuba, for Haiti, for the Dominican Republic. And then, as back to the snowball effect, as more and more people learn about the book, they said, well, I'm working on Haiti, wouldn't you be interested on a chapter in Haiti? And I was, of course, yes, but back then you said no, or back then I couldn't find anyone for Cuba. So I think with another second volume, we would cover some of those holes, and then again, I mean, who knows where this leads, but I think there's enough in Latin America for sure to have two volumes, and to think about the region that way. And again, I'm not saying that this is the last word. Sometimes when I present the book, people say, "Okay, great. So now we know why Latin America is underdeveloped. Are we done?" And of course not. We're not done. We haven't answered Latin American underdevelopment. We haven't answered any country underdevelopment in this book. But I think that we are providing maybe a new way of looking at the problems. And I think your chapter is a great example of that. It's a topic that many people have discussed in history, but it's something that we just didn't have the methods. I mean, many of these things were invented in a few years ago. So now we can see old questions with new data, new methods, and I think that's super exciting.
Let me go back to this idea that one of the contributions of the book is to go beyond a traditional way of thinking about the region, that is thinking about Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, right? Which, I mean, again, right, we're not what has been done, decades of research has been profoundly useful, and we have taken advantage of that, and thanks to that work we are able to do what we do today. But clearly one of the very nice things of the book, despite the omissions that are of course the result of the practical limitations of the endeavor, it's quite exhaustive in terms of how many places you're exploring, right? There's a chapter on Suriname. Many of us have never been to Suriname. We know nothing about Suriname. And in general, in the conversation about what Latin America is, people don't regularly think about Suriname, right? And there's just one example of, there's a chapter on Paraguay that you wrote, and with your co-author, of course, and plenty more, right? And then, so I want to hear a bit more about that, how important that was at the very beginning of the project, or if this was an unexpected result of how the project evolved. But I also want to ask you about one of the things that you mentioned about Alberto's conclusion, because part of what he does at some point is to suggest that maybe this idea of nation states, which guides a bit this entire conversation that we're having, that we should include more nations and we should think about this from that perspective, is probably not the most appropriate. In particular, we're thinking about the past, right? And in colonial times, we had just different structures. And well, if we go further in time, we have even different units that, and maybe those are the ones that we should consider. So how do you think about that? How do you think that the book reflects on that issue? And how do you deal with that in your own research? I want to hear about that.
Okay, so let me start with the easier part because answering Alberto's very deep point is harder. Um, Countries, it's a practical matter, and it was just easier to look at a map and say, okay, we're missing Chile, and we need to cover the whole region, and so that was just kind of like easier. But I was very interested in not only having, as you said, Mexico, Peru, and sometimes Cuba. I mean, we don't have Cuba, unfortunately, but one other country, and that's it. I was actually interested in trying to get as many countries as possible. I was especially happy to have a chapter on the Guyanas, on Suriname, which, I mean, I guess most of your audience or a lot of your audience is Latin American, but maybe half of it would not be, but it is not. But we have no clue about Suriname, Guyana. It's as if they were in a different continent. And actually, it was through Dutch scholars, in this case, Peter Kudjis, also a Stanford professor, that I got this chapter. And we had to go through Amsterdam to learn about Suriname. They don't play football with us, so they essentially don't exist. But once you see their history, they have the same plantation model, the same slavery legacy, very much Latin American. We could argue whether Puerto Rico is Latin American or not. There's a great chapter by Mateo Uribe Castro and Matthew Curtis on this. But in practice, once you look at the chapter, it's all about natural endowments, a la Engerman and Sokolov, about the deficits and expansions of education. And all of Latin America has that problematic. So, I mean, I had no qualms with saying Puerto Rico should be in the book. And of course, some purists are going to say, but oh, Puerto Rico is American and it's a territory. Why is it doing there? I mean, I really don't care about those types of definitions. So that was very important for me. I guess also coming from the bank. I mean, in the bank, there, from the World Bank, there's a lot of insistence when you talk about Latin America and the Caribbean. Sometimes, and of course, country officers are always very mad when you present, oh, this is the Latin American outlook, and it's based on 2 or 3 economists. So Brazil, Mexico, and Peru or Colombia. And then it was important to have Central America, and there's great work being done in the region. So we have a chapter on the what now is Chiquita, but back then was the United Fruit Company, and its impact in Costa Rica. That's by Diana Van Patten and Esteban Mendez Chacon. We have a great chapter for El Salvador, which I think it's a super unstudied country. That's by Eduardo Montero. We have a great chapter by Rachel McLeary looking at the religious missions in Guatemala. So it was also important to not only have Mexico, but have a lot of other countries. Of course, there's some that are missing. There's nothing about Panama. There's nothing about the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba. I mean, we can go on and on. But it was important to at least have some of that representation. And then after doing all of this work, Alberto comes with this very valid point, which is, I mean, the whole structure is wrong because countries and national identities, that's all endogenous and that's all probably a 20th century phenomenon in Latin America, and it's a 19th century construct in Europe. So why are we talking about countries? And he's right. And actually, even in economics, it's a bit hard to talk about countries. So when I ask people, what can you please write a chapter about, I don't know, Haiti, Colombia, Venezuela? It was a bit off because in economics we think more about ideas and the generalizability of that idea. But I think that here, for me at least, it was important to keep track of countries. And I mean, sure, you can go deep into one topic, migration, elite formation, whatever, but it was important to have that boundary. Maybe at some point we would break those boundaries and just have more interregional chapters, or have some comparative chapter. If you want to study slavery, why not do it between Brazil, Colombia, and I don't know, Cuba. And if you want to do migration, you want to do maybe Argentina and the US even, and Brazil, etc., etc. But I think Alberto's point is that borders are endogenous. I think the counterpoint to that is that a lot of colonial history helped to shape those borders. So I think that we are in between us in many things, Europe and Africa. In Europe, borders are very organic. So the border between France and Germany has been fought for hundreds of years and millions of lives. In Africa, at least if you believe Stelios and Elias, borders are basically a creation of the 1884 Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa. So they're kind of irrelevant, and they're actually breaking through a lot of ethnic boundaries. In Latin America, we're a bit in between. So actually, that's something interesting. We don't have, I mean, we're a very violent continent, unfortunately, but we didn't have all of these interstate wars that Europe had. And actually, if you read people like Centeno, they say, oh, that's why we have bad state capacity. So we should have had more international conflict. I don't think that that's the solution, but that's kind of the argument. Having said that, our boundaries are a lot more organic than the African boundary. So he has, and again, I encourage people to actually look at least at the pictures of the book, because he has this great slide and this great picture where he shows the former colonial provincial boundaries and how more or less they correspond to today's national and subnational boundaries. And so in that sense, yes, boundaries are endogenous. I fully buy the argument, but I was not going to be able to find someone and say, like, can you please write about the intendencia of some obscure region in Chile, because it was hard enough to find someone to write about Chile. So boundaries are endogenous. Boundaries should be crossed, and that's something that I strongly believe in, not only in economics or in historical development, but it was just a way to organize the book. And maybe the two other, or the main things that Alberto stresses are, one, why don't we look more at the Pacific? I think that's something that is being done. I mean, we're both in the Pacific now. I'm in Vancouver, you're in Palo Alto. And I think we very much look towards China and Asia in general from here. It's not something that we do a lot in Latin America, when we have very important Chinese and especially Japanese populations. If you think about Sao Paulo, you think about Peru, and just let's look at Asia and the Pacific. I think that's one of Alberto's invitation, and I fully agree with that. And that's also important politically and economically. I mean, if you think about that in what's going on nowadays with the APEC summit, and et cetera, et cetera. But also let's think about other populations. So I write in the introduction that the history of Latin America, but any place, it's the history of its people. And we think a lot about Europeans and colonization, but I mean, we have the indigenous people, so that's the whole pre-colonial ethnic side of things that, I mean, it's there and it's very present in some countries. I mean, obviously in Mexico, Bolivia, Ecuador, Guatemala, and also that forced migration. I mean, the movement of almost or more than 10 million enslaved individuals from Africa. So Alberto says, let's embrace that, and that's something that is very much in vogue now, at least in North America, and think about that Afro-Latin legacy and think about not only when Europeans arrived here or in Latin America, but what was there before. What about the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire? And there was a lot of things going on economically, socially, culturally, before Europeans came. So I think that's also a valid call. And a few chapters. I mean, for instance, the chapter for Bolivia is full on what happens with policies in contexts that are very mixed ethnically. So in this case, is looking or focusing on the Quechuas and the Aymaras in Bolivia, but that's one chapter. And Rachel does something similar for Guatemala and the missionaries, and that's something that again I've studied in Paraguay with the Guarani. So and that it's a different way of thinking about the continent, right? Like I mean, the Guarani have no national delimitation. They are in Argentina, they're in Paraguay, they're in Brazil, and the whole 2P expansion. And it's not about thinking about like borders in that way. So yes, there are borders, but this was a practical way to organize the book, and a very valid reflection by Alberto to think about differently about the region.
Let me keep this sort of meta tone, the conversation, and because I want to ask you about, and going back to the initial question about what makes us new and compared to what, and you mentioned las venas abiertas and whatever is this ancient old previous view of the region had, in my opinion, a certain emphasis on the outside world, right? And if you think about the even Ocampos and Bertola's approach, it's also following a bit that spirit, right? So commodity prices are crucial, and a lot of the way in which we thought about the region was, well, we're this tiny peripheral region, and the outcomes of our societies are the result of that in a certain way, right? I have the impression, this is my reading, but I want to hear how you think about this, that despite this very relevant critique or reflection that Alberto makes, we're thinking a lot about the region from the inside, right? So do you agree with that? Do you think that that's actually the case? How much, and maybe are we probably looking too much to us or like to the inside, and maybe we're actually missing bringing back some of the role of international trade, of capital flows, of right? How do you think about that? And I mean, the book is quite heterogeneous. There are chapters that talk about migration and so on. But yeah, well, how do you think about these issues?
I think that's a great point, and I think you're right. I think you're right. So if we think back about, let's start with Venas Abiertas de América Latina, this Uruguayan classic. One way to summarize that book is Latin American underdevelopment is the imperialist fault. So there's a big empire, usually the Yankee empire, the Gringo empire, and it's all their fault. We're poor because of the Europeans. We're poor because of the Americans. That's one way to see it. I think there was a time also a more structuralist approach. If you think about dependency theory, if you think about import substitution, it's not exactly that approach, but it says there are some terms of trade internationally. We're a small open economy in the big scope of things. So if the prices of coffee and oil go down and we're producing those things, we're stuck in unfavorable terms of trade. And so it's still very much an outside perspective. I think that even when we think about how Latin American fell behind, and there's a lot in the book that also deals with colonialism, that's still thinking through the European lens, which I think it's important. but that's probably going to be one third of the story, no? So you have these colonialists that are coming to the Americas, but you also have the Americans that were already there, and then you have these Africans that are brought from Africa, and these slaves that are brought from Africa without their permission, of course. But then you also have these Chinese and Japanese and other Asian waves of migration. If you think about the Indian diaspora in the Caribbean, it's big. I mean, Naipaul is a Nobel Prize winner that is very much on that current. So I think that yes, the book maybe thinks about Latin America from the inside, from itself, from its roots, from its ethnic roots, from its pre-colonial and colonial past. And I also think, I mean, I don't want to be here about like nationalities and stuff, but most of the scholars are also Latin American. So I mentioned our Dutch colleagues who are writing about Suriname, but you're Colombian writing about Colombia. I'm Colombian writing about Paraguay, and now with all of these discussions of identities and who the researcher is and whether that matters or not. I think that at the end of the day, we are a group of mostly young Latin American scholars thinking about the region from within. Is it then completely about that lens? No. I think that as you were also saying, maybe the external part is important. Obviously, international trade is important. Obviously, migration is important. Obviously, FDI flows are important. I mean, the chapter of Costa Rica, it's a US company that is very important in one Central American country. I mean, it will be great to expand that analysis to other companies and to other countries. So the rest and the West, and in our case, the US matters a lot. But I think that it's a good deep point, that it's a way of thinking about the region from the region, by mostly people from the region, and maybe they're not all working on their country. And I also like that fact that there are people from one country in Latin America writing about another one. But I think it's a good summary. It's a good summary, at least relative to the existing previous literature.
Now I'm thinking about I want to ask you more about how you picked the crew, right? Because I feel that the way in which your editorial style is indeed very flexible. It reminded me, I don't know if you've heard this story, and I'm struggling to remember now the name of, but this was the coach of one of the good Brazilian national soccer teams of the one that had Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, and so on. And I remember that once they asked him how he managed to train such a good team or something like that. And he said something quite clever that was, I don't train them, I pick them, right? And I have the impression that that was a bit your approach, right? So what you thought was, okay, I'll try to bring the people that I think would do a good job here. Tell me a bit more about how you thought about the people. How much did you have to push them to deliver things on time? That's usually something that editors suffer quite a bit with. How was that process? I mean, I have the impression, as you want to do a second volume, so it probably was not as traumatic as most of the editors I talk with usually describe. But yeah, tell me about that.
Yeah, so maybe back in full circle, I remember, even though I hated these financial bubble scores by Joachim at Pompeo, one of the exercises, and I give that to my students now, was how do you write a bibliography? So obviously now with ChatGPT and all these tools, it's different. But kind of the key was, once you find the key person or the key set of people, it's very easy. So it was more about finding that person or that set of authors. So let me, I don't know, think about Chile and the legacy of the Pinochet regime. Felipe Gonzalez and Monu Prem, who wrote the chapter, have written most of these chapters. So yeah, you can go on Google Scholar and type the legacies of the Pinochet regime, and after a few clicks, you're going to end up with these key researchers. So I think that they weren't that hard to find, but then you need to ask them whether they're willing to write a chapter of a book about the country when we don't think about countries, and we already discussed that, for free, because at the end of the day we're in academia, for a book that is of course not going to be anywhere close to any of the famous books that we were talking about in during the Latin American boom. And surprisingly, funnily, and happily enough, most of them said yes. The ones that said yes delivered wonderful chapters. So that it's a hard job to be an editor, but if you have a great team of authors and co-authors, it's a delight. And so probably the hardest part is going to be to insist on someone to say, "Oh, please send me the chapter." But I mean, that was usually not the case. Of course, you have to read a lot, but it was very interesting. I mean, I was super interested in learning more about all of these countries and all of these problematics and issues. So it wasn't that hard. I mean, I think again, once you find the right people, and then how do you find them? From conferences. I'm involved in a few things. So I'm involved in La SEA, for instance, and we're just talking about the conference before we started. I'm also involved in Ridge, and a few other organizations. So I mean, I've seen some of these papers before, and I was also daydreaming and thinking, oh, it would be great if at some point we could have Javier write a chapter about elite and network formation in Antioquia. But I mean, who knows? I mean, he's at Stanford. Maybe he has other more interesting things to do. And then you said yes. So then after a certain point, I mean, there's also again this snowball effect, and you tell other people, well, Javier is writing, and so is writing, and so at some point people don't want to be left behind. And I think that's gonna make the second volume easier, because they're gonna see and say, oh, that's something that also some people that I talk to ask me. They say, oh, I'm Venezuelan, and who wrote the Venezuela chapter, so and so. Why didn't you ask me? Or I mean, I'm just making an example here of any random country. So but that's great, just to see that there is enough supply, that we can have like some cohesive product, again, mostly on methodological lines, but I think even on thematic lines, and I would even say even on chronological lines, even though we didn't ask for a colonial chapter and a pre-colonial chapter and a 20th century and an 18th century chapter, all of these time periods are covered. So I'm actually going to use the book to teach next term, which is also going to be a challenge. But so far is shaping up in thinking about, are most countries covered? Yes. Are some of the key topics covered? Yes. And I mean, can you make a few additions so that all of the time periods are covered? And the answer is yes. I mean, of course, you're going to need to expand here and there, but that could be volume 2, or those could be extra readings. So I hope that this is, at the end of the day, not only a research tool and a way for people that are interested in particular countries, like to go to that chapter for Ecuador and see what's the literature there, but also a more or less useful teaching tool. And so I encourage you and your readers to and your listeners, sorry, and all the readers of your chapter and the listeners of your podcast that probably has more followers than our book, to tell me what the experience was, also on the teaching side. And I'm sure that when I teach it next semester, there are going to be a lot of new ideas, and from students asking, oh, why didn't you cover this other topic, which is so important in this country? So that's probably going to be the assignment for them to say, okay, you think that's so important, why don't you write a short term paper on that? Anyways, but that's getting more and more on the teaching side.
Yeah, I'm actually going to use it. I mean, you know about this. I'm teaching this
Mhm.
course on the political economy of Latin America in the spring quarter. And I mean, the book is basically going to be the basis of it. So, but yeah, I mean, it's going to be pretty interesting to see the feedback that results from that, right? Teaching in that sense, it's always very fruitful, right? Like students have these insights that it's hard to foresee when you're working on your desk. But let
Yeah.
me I wanna I have two final questions that build on your something that has been there in basically all the answers that you have given me, which is a very personal approach that you have to doing research, right? And and I wanna ask you about, you started even like describing the role of your mentors in shaping your career, right? And you talk about Bill, and you talk about Joachim, and you're yourself by now a mentor of several people. The last time that I saw you, I think, was this conference at Harvard, maybe. And it was funny, even image, because it was like a family of dogs, right? And you were like going around. There was this entire group of young scholars, most of them from British Columbia, behind you, right? And by now you're a great champion of young people interested in Latin America in general. So I want to ask you about that at a personal level. How do you deal with that role of being a mentor? How seriously do you take it? How important do you think that it is? And I want you to connect that, if you can, with your view of the field. And I mean by this, the discussion or the emergence of ideas on Latin America from this long-term perspective. And how do you think that is the future of that field, right? Because I know that we are the new, but we're not as young as we were when we started working on the book, right? And there are new things happening, and part of what you're trying to do, I try to do what I can from like my side to foster those people coming. Is probably an important part of it. But are you concerned about, how optimistic are you? Do you think that we're going the right direction? Do you think that we're being uh, having the voice that we deserve? And this sounds a bit like to maybe even walk or something that is not exactly probably in the direction where I want to direct the question. But do you think that in the international academic environment, the work on the history of Latin America is as value as it deserves? Do you think that changing in the years that come? How do you think about that big issue of people thinking about Latin America from this long-term perspective?
Okay, no, I think that these are all great points. I think you nailed it on the mentorship, and maybe this was a COVID thing. Before the pandemic, I remember I was the student trying to catch some professor and asking whether this idea that I had about, I don't know, the Jesuit missions or whatever was worthwhile. And then after the pandemic, some students would approach me and say, "Oh, do you think that this idea was interesting?" So that was weird. It was kind of like a fake it until you make it moment. But more seriously, I mean, I think that it's something that at some point, yeah, you change roles a bit, and I think that in my case was maybe with the pandemic, before and after. Um, but what we have been doing with Ridge, with LASEA, gradually, I think is it's fostering students from the region, young researchers from the region, hopefully from coming in many cases from Latin American universities, um, either their undergrad or their masters, and then maybe ending up at universities like yours. I mean, one of my of our co-authors and RAs is now at Stanford. And we have many Colombian and Latin American students at UBC. And I think that's almost the best and most rewarding role when it's not about you or your research, but you get chapters. I mean, just mention one, but like the chapter on concertaje in Ecuador from Alex Rivadeneira, who's not even a historian, he's a macro guy working in the Banco de Mexico. And you read that thing and you're blown away. And I think that the quality of the research, we've talked a lot about your chapter on networks, that quality speaks for itself. And it's being recognized. I mean, I started with Melissa, but it's true. I mean, before there was one article on Latin America. I remember when Stelios and Elias asked us to participate in their CPR economic history book. And there were maybe 2 or 3 chapters for Latin America. I was writing on Paraguay. Melissa was writing on Peru and Bolivia. Joanna Naritomi and her team were writing about Brazil, and that's it. But honestly, there was one paper, which was Melissa Dell's 2010 Econometrica. Now, I mean, if you want that count, which I'm not saying is the best count, but if you want the top 5 count, the Costa Rica chapter was published in Econometrica. I mean, not the chapter, but the original article. The Salvador chapter was published in the JPE. Part of the Paraguay chapter I had published at the QJE. So I think there's a lot of quality also in Latin America. So and that's important. It's not only quantity but quality. I have high hopes that some of the chapters that haven't been published and the original research that they emanate from would be highly published. Whether that's gonna change the image, that's very hard. I mean, these things of like, how much attention do we deserve? I would say that it's a region that is less studied than others. For instance, Africa, even though it's a region that is richer. So I mean, Latin America, again, back to this middle income trap, if you will. We are not Europe, we are not North America, but we're not Africa. So there's a lot of historically development research that looked at India, that looked at Africa, but more and more Latin America. I mean, I remember when I was in undergrad or in grad school, development was India 1 and India 2 in undergrad. Then in grad school, there was a little bit more of Africa. Now there's a lot of Africa, there's more in Latin America, but probably not enough. And even when you think about Latin America, we're back to Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Colombia. Colombia is actually very studied, maybe because there's a lot of economists. But we know very little. I mean, when I worked on Paraguay, there were 2 or 3 articles on Paraguay, and that's it. Not only in economic history, but Laura Schecher and Fred Finan had an article, and that was pretty much it. So even writing 2 more is doubling the output of Paraguayan countries. It's incredible that we know so little about the Dominican Republic. I mean, it's a rich country. It has a crazy dictatorship, an amazing novel. Maybe you can't do better than Vargas Llosa. But we know so little. There's a lot of interest now in Haiti. Again, is Haiti Latin America, given that it's so French and all these things? I don't care. But that'll be super interesting to study. Cuba, I think it's so important in colonial times. It's so important for sugar, for slavery. It's so important during the 20th century. There should be more, and there's not more. So I think that what we can do in the book, with you as author, with me as editor, and in our work, is to showcase that that's interesting and important and do it well. And then I think it's up for people to judge whether they think that it's a relevant perspective or not. I mean, I obviously think that it's very important and that it will get the attention that it deserves. So if we did a bad job, I think that people are going to be critical and just ignore the book. But if we did an okay or a good job, um, I'm getting invited at Stanford to talk, so that's already great attention, I think. And jokes aside, I think it's going to be a great opportunity for your listeners. And with the book, I mean, there comes things that didn't happen before. Like we were talking about Cartagena. I was a keynote in the Colombian Economic History Association. I mean, that wouldn't have happened without the book. And honestly, I have feel like free writing, because I wrote one chapter in the introduction, and then I talk about all of this research that is not mine. But again, it's in a positive way, because if anything, like, we're helping to channel some voices back to the California ethnic and identity issues that maybe weren't heard before, and some voices from Latin America, some voices about indigenous communities, some voices about the Afro legacy in Latin America that weren't heard before. So I think that if there is quality, hopefully the product won't be ignored. And I think that there is quality. So you wanted me to think about how I see research in the region. So, and I think that's a better way to end it, which is, instead of saying we deserve more attention or less attention, because then what about Asia, or should we compete with Australia? I think that the conclusion after reading these 20 chapters, 600 pages, is that the state, like in the US, like the State of the Union, so the state of the literature is strong. There's a lot of exciting work. So this is honestly, I mean, I know that it's a common analogy, but this is the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more. I mean, there's at least volume 2 more. And then is there volume 3? I don't know, because I mean, you're saying that we're not that young anymore, and you're much younger than me. So then I think that it's up for other voices. And sure, I'm happy to mentor students, but I also think that at some point, maybe you're not as useful as a mentor if you continue that role forever. And so I think that this might be a good time to coalesce a nice group of exciting young scholars. Like I remember not too long ago, we were doing the reach on the economic history of Latin America in Uruguay, and I was blown away from some researchers that I knew, but others I have no clue about. So I'm thinking about, maybe it's not that great to name names, but people, for instance, coming from PSE that I have never heard about before, that are doing super exciting work. So I mean, the present of Latin American economic history research is good. The future is so much brighter. And I think that maybe what you were saying, of they would say like, oh, these roots of underdevelopment, they're gonna say, oh yeah, when there were about these 20 friends talking about the countries that they knew. But the explosion, the boom, the Latin American boom, the booming field is only starting. So I think that this is a nice coalescing of that knowledge, but the most exciting part is yet to come. And I also think that honestly, that's true for Latin America. I was happy to study and live in Europe, but it's a continent with a very glorious past. But it's not a continent where you feel the future. I mean, you feel the future in California, maybe you feel the future in Vancouver, and you definitely feel the future in Latin America. And I know that we are a complex, poor, unequal, challenging region, but also a super exciting, rich, diverse, promising region. And I mean, here we're only looking from the lens of economic history, but I think this is true economically and politically. So when we say, yeah, we're only a peripheral region, the U.S. is the U.S. is the biggest, the richest country in the world. Its biggest trading partner is now Mexico. It's not China anymore. Latin America as a whole, it's 700 million inhabitants today and growing. I think that maybe, and I don't know if this is a good closing thought, but maybe instead of these borders that we discussed, I mean, united we are strong, and I think that this goes beyond Bolivar and obviously goes beyond UNASUR and Chavez and
Yes.
sadly a very politicized debate. But more regional integration was a key for Europe, and I think it could be a key for Latin America. I mean, I'm not proposing a common currency between Brazil and Argentina, which is a joke, but at least to get to know each other better, so that we are not as ensimismados, as navel gazing, as looking at only ourselves, but going to Paraguay and seeing, you are in Stanford and you're seeing, and I think that when you are in outside Latin America, you also get a Latin American perspective. So I'm sure that what you see out of Stanford, it's more regional than Colombian. And what I see at Vancouver is definitely more regional than Colombian. And to thinking ourselves as a region, it's important. It's important academically, it's important intellectually, but I think it could be important politically and economically. And we should be proud of our region. I mean, it's not something that we should be ashamed like at all. I mean, it's exciting and it's challenging, but it's amazing. So and it was so great to edit this book. I mean, it's a joy because I mean this is such an exciting region, especially in history. I mean, we really have 500 years of colonization, and we have a super strong pre-colonial ethnic past, and an incredible mix of African, Asian, European, indigenous. I mean, it's a great continent. Like I'm so happy that I'm editing this book and not the book of some other continent.
I'm super glad that we're finishing this conversation with that tone, because also it's a full art, right? Connecting how we and how you thought about this book as in a certain way a means to talk about the region today. That's precisely how you're framing the conversation now. I want to thank you not just for taking time to chat about the region today, but I want to thank you about working on this. This was a very long effort. You started working on this when you were a young assistant professor. I'm pretty sure that people probably suggested you against involving in this project. Books are not exactly the most highly appreciated type of outcome in our discipline, but you've done something very, very important. I think it goes beyond whatever the citation metrics that could result from this. I think you're helping to build like the identity of the way in which we think about the region, and the impact of this is going to be much larger, right? I'm pretty optimistic about that. So thank you. Thanks for all that hard work. It was also pretty enjoyable. It was great to chat with you today, Felipe.
Yeah, likewise. No, so let me thank you as an author, co-author of this book. Let me also take the opportunity and thank every single author and co-author of this book. It was a joy talking to you. It was a joy editing this book. I was happily encouraged at UBC. Patrick Francois, my former chair, said, "Sure, why don't you take a big risk?" And this is a big risk. But I think it goes back to this idea that we are more together. And I mean, your research or my research is only gonna reach a certain audience, but if we have a team of more than 30 researchers saying something interesting about Latin America, we're stronger together. And I think that we can make a big splash, more than our individual articles or citation metrics, which are honestly secondary. No one's gonna get famous with an academic book. No one's gonna get rich with an academic book. But I think that we do it because we love the region and we love the type of research that is being done. And maybe let me close by opening, just like Alberto closed the book by opening a whole set of new questions, which is an invitation to your listeners to get involved, to read the book, but also to challenge the book and to say, look, I mean, I'm from this country and I'm very interested in this topic and I want to write something myself. And again, this, I know it's a joke, this fake it until you make it, but that's how we all started. I mean, like now I guess some people would think that I'm speaking from a position of authority, which I'm not. Sure, I'm the editor of this book, but I don't consider that to be important in any regard. It's a huge honor and a huge pleasure, but I'm not speaking from a position of authority. And I'm speaking from a position of inviting you, if you think that your ideas are interesting and worth pursuing. They are, and I think that we hear the no and the negatives a lot in academia. And then 5 years later or more, you have amazing articles on things that no one believed in. So just do it. Just do it. And this is, if anything, an invitation to more and more people to get involved and think of the region not the way that we tell them that it is or it should be, but the way that you think that it should be. And those are probably going to be the ones speaking out of Stanford in 10 years. Who knows what the technology would be, a hologram or something, and talking about something, and they would say, oh, back in the day, these people doing the roots of underdevelopment, and maybe they would laugh a little bit, but it's what we can do today. But I think that the future is brighter, and I'm sure that great things are going to come out in the next 10 and 20 years in the region, academically, but also economically and socially.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged, thank you, and take care.